Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War Frontline update for the 10th of January 2024. If you don't know what the lines on our map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment, pause the video. Thanks so much to JR who's done the mapping update for today. I'm so busy at the moment, but he is just incredible. However, one consolation might be that actually there's not a great deal of change at the moment to the front lines, and we'll talk about that. It's going to be something to discuss. Before we go to that northeastern sector, that axis, from Kupiansk to Svatove to Crimea, we'll just pop into a Radu Hosu, the Romanian analyst, who says, starting in October 2023, the Russians announced around the same time as the culmination of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, a counteroffensive. They announced it with great fanfare. On the eastern axis, meaning the Kupiansk-Svatove-Crimea front, they then announced a counteroffensive with over 1,000 tanks and armoured vehicles and 100,000 men. So remember that whole northeastern area and the idea that they've got all those men stacked up ready to go. I didn't take them seriously. My mistake. The truth is, it wasn't just my mistake. It was their mistake too. They took themselves altogether too seriously. Now let's get down to facts. So in the Kupiansk direction, the Kupiansk offensive, between the approximate date August 2023 and now, when they effectively launched their counteroffensive on this front, and today, the Russian army has not advanced more than 6 kilometers west of Svatove. The ground reclaimed by the Ukrainian counterattacks. At this point, as maps, satellite and drone imagery indicate, the Russians have reached their culmination and will have to go into rotation and conserve the forces they have in the area. Estimated losses are over 400 armoured vehicles visually confirmed, so losses may be even higher throughout this period, and over 30,000 personnel, according to some sources. Mind you, sources should always be taken with a grain of salt. 30,000 people, 5 times what they lost in 9 years in Afghanistan for almost no square kilometres of land gained. So he's painting a picture that things are not good in the Kupiansk direction, really, considering that this is a period of counter-offensive for the Russians. And actually, he's right. All things considered, there are areas where the Russians have gained on the front line, and we have seen some gains around here, although there might be a little bit of walking back of some of those gains or counterattacks. We have seen some small gains around the Svatove area and around the Ivanivka area here near Yahidny. So, yes, there are some small gains, but this is a major military power, second greatest army in the world, supposedly, on the attack. And it's been months of not really getting anywhere, particularly in this northeastern axis where the Ukrainians weren't attacking themselves, really. The Ukrainians were concentrating in the south and in Bakhmut, but not up here. And so the Russians had the opportunity to do all sorts up here and have achieved very, very little. As we can see from Suryat maps, they say that the situation north of Donetsk during the last hours of the Ukrainian army stabilized the front line east of Terny following the arrival of reinforcements in the previous day. So that's quite a fair bit of territory, all things considered. We're not used to seeing the Ukrainians gain, particularly, and certainly in this area. So there could be some counterattacks with reserves in the area, reinforcements in the area, pushing the Russians back from some fairly significant gains that they were making. Andrew Perpetua also states that the Russians could be a little further back, even though his mapping hasn't changed. He said there is some shelling in the area that suggests that, I think Russian shelling in the area that suggests that the Ukrainians are further forward than he possibly has at the moment. So, yeah, things going a little bit better for the Ukrainians in that particular area. And then we come on down past the northern Bakhmut area, past the Seversk front line to Bakhmut. And as you can see, no changes there at all. Andrew Perpetua has nothing really to say about that. Kenneth Gregg, it's the Finnish fighter that's been out in Ukraine. He's not on the front line at the moment, doing more charity work there now, but he said that fighting continues north and south of Avdiivka, west of Krymova, and north of Klishchivka in the district. This is, yes, I think that's all he has to say Oh no, it does go on to say down here. We'll carry on reading. In the district of Avdiivka in Stepova, we pushed back Russian troops in the area 480 meters wide and 250 meters deep on the eastern edge up to the forest belt of west of the railway. This is because the Russians weakened their troops, moving their 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade from that area to northern Klishchivka. The Russians want to improve their position by taking the ridges at Klishchivka as they are sitting ducks in the valley. So the claim here is that the Russians have brought some of their troops from around here to fight. I think that's what he's saying, to fight in Klishchivka rather than taking them from the Bodnivka area to fight in Klishchivka. But certainly one of those two. This is to suggest that they do, and there's a lot of truth in this. The Russians will be finding this area of Klishchivka to its west, the heights, where they have the trench system that they're fighting over. This is important for them. There's no point going, fighting too much over the west of that. This is the key to the whole of Klishchivka. Without taking this, the Russians below in the lower ground here are, as he says, sitting ducks. But in order to, you've got to rob Peter to pay Paul. So in order to the Klishchivka axis sector is being supported, they're having to take those troops from elsewhere. And Radihosu says of Bakhmut, we'll go down to that one. The offensive, which began sometime around October the 22nd, when including the Ukrainian armed forces reached their culmination, mostly on the southern flank of the city and in perhaps the most successful Russian military operation in the last 4 months, except for killing hundreds of civilians. There they are exceptionally effective. Advancing a few kilometers in the northern flank and capturing the town of Kromova and advancing towards Chaziv Yar. The offensive has not yet, in my view, peaked, and the Russians still have forces to push towards Chaziv Yar. That's his personal speculation, he says. They won't reach Chaziv Yar in the winter months. And this is kind of talking to what I was saying the other day, or repeatedly, that the Russians, I don't think, are going to find it easy to take Chaziv Yar because the Ukrainians are defending it as much as possible because it is important to them. They understand that Chaziv Yar is, it's a well-defended, well-fortified place, but it is rather key to all these settlements behind and in that crescent around. So they need to defend that. In order to defend that, they need to put down a stronger defensive line towards its east. They can't just let the Russians keep on taking this land until they get to Chaziv Yar. And it looks like the fighting is going to be over this sort of Kromova-Bodnivka area that we have seen. But yeah, no changes at all to the mapping around there, having said all of that. And then we come down to Avdiivka, where, as you can see, there are no changes there either. Andrew Perpetua has some increase in Ukrainian territory around here as they've pushed into, or at least the mapping indicates that it might be a rejig, but the Ukrainians are in some land here where he previously had not thought they were. So that's looking better for the Ukrainians than in that northern area on the way to Novomykhailivka. The ISW, just to state that, I forgot to show you the Bakhmut paragraph, but they are looking to capture Ivanivska, which is to the south of Bakhmut, and of course creeping towards Chaziv Yar. And that's what I was talking about, acknowledging the potential of Russian gains in the area will likely continue to be gradual, and that a rapid advance to Chaziv Yar is unlikely. I would agree with that. But I mean, look at this for Avdiivka. That suggests that things have slowed down an awful lot there. That is the entirety of Avdiivka, because the next paragraph talks about Novomykhailivka and Marinka. So incredible that Avdiivka, that was so chaotic and hot in terms of attacks, has now really calmed down. Radu Hosu says of this area, on the 6th of October 2023, the offensive against Avdiivka began de facto. For those who have not been following events or are not aware of the geography of Ukraine, Avdiivka is a suburb of Donetsk city, the capital of Donetsk Oblast, and the largest city in Donbass. Avdiivka is a town that before Russia's invasion in 2014 had a population of about 32,000. From then until today, with few interruptions and without any interruption since the 24th of February 2022, it's been besieged by the Russian army as a frontline settlement. In the Russian offensive that began on the 6th of October, the Russians lost confirmed vehicle losses of over 300 armoured vehicles, and the number of soldiers lost by the Russians is over 20,000. These are the most decent estimates. Here, the Russians lost up to 500 soldiers per day in November 2023, at a loss rate estimated by British intelligence to be up to 7 Russian killed or wounded per 1 Ukrainian, which is absolutely devastating. He finishes, Avdiivka, unlike Bakhmut, is, in case anyone is curious about Russian interest in it, is a town that can be a springboard on an operational level, in that a Russian conquest of it would make it easier for them to move on to towns like Pavlograd or even to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk concentration, which is currently fortified. But what military analysts, including myself, see as the offensive for Avdiivka is a personal demand on the part of Putin, who has an election in March this year and must deliver a victory to his people, whether the victory means conquering a city now deserted and destroyed. And I've sort of mentioned this before, that it does have it does have operational use, Avdiivka, both in terms of Donetsk city itself, but also, as Radiohosu says, if you're going to launch an attack up to Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, and so on, it'd be great to have forces in this whole area so that, you could surround the end of the crescent like that and move up through Konstantinivka to Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. But goodness me, as I keep saying, you know how long it took the Russians to take Bakhmut. So to expect them to take Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk, that's what's that, 10 years work? And that doesn't even get them the whole of the Donbass. So just, goodness me. However, having said that, even though it does have operational significance, it does very much look like a politically derived offensive in this area. As in, Putin wanted something to shout about for his March elections. And I don't know. I was thinking previously that Avdiivka could fall, because actually it is really precarious. It doesn't take an awful lot. So it's this road coming into the west. Now, if the Russians are here, they only need to advance, 2.5 kilometers in that direction. And, really from there, they're 2 kilometers from the road. So, a couple of kilometers either way, and that road is seriously under pressure. It's effectively interdicted. And with that being interdicted, that's the end of being able to supply your people in Avdiivka. So it is, scare quotes, relatively easy to win Avdiivka. However, it is not relatively easy, because the Russians are just unable to puncture through in the coke plant area, but also along these flat grounds here. It's just suicidal at the moment for them. And they just end up losing so many troops and vehicles. And so, what should be incredibly precarious for the Ukrainians has turned out to be, fairly solid in terms of their defense, and the Russians have been unable to break through. So anyway, that's the Avdiivka area. As we come further to the south, you can see here Marinka, no changes. Andrew Perpetua saying there could be a Ukrainian counterattack going on north of these water features there. He's not 100% sure, but there are some rumours coming out that the Ukrainians might be trying to push back there. As we can see from Surat maps, we have 2 gains for the Russians in the area between really Vuhledar, Vladimirovka, and Novomykhailivka. So just south of Novomykhailivka, we have, first of all, the Russians began advancing northwest of Solodka, trying to increase the salient towards Novomykhailivka. And then they added this part on just above it, which you can see here. The Russians continue increasing the salient towards Novomykhailivka. So that is what Surat map says. That suggests that all of this area is a gain for the Russians. As you can see from what JL has actually increased the line for deep state maps really considerably. Actually, I hadn't thanked him for that, so thank you publicly, JR. He's taken it from around Novelska, and he's taken it all the way down to Marinka, and all the way down pretty much to almost this. Well, he has, I think, yeah, because it goes along that white line down to Volodymyrivka. So anyway, deep state map and Surat maps has Russians having some gains in that area, and that's pretty much all the gains they have. And that'll be a very loud Ring doorbell going off. And as we come down round the corner along the southern front line, we've got Velika Novosilka, and we have the Robotina area, where there isn't too much to report of there. And that gets us on to, which area is that? Yeah, we're going to get to Dnipro River and Krynky. Now, there is some possibly really good news for the Ukrainians in Krynky. So we've seen this area there that's been a salient that's been squeezed and squeezed by the Russians as they pile in reinforcements and equipment personnel to this area to try and push the Ukrainians back across the river. And the Ukrainians have been constricted more and more. It's a tiny little bridgehead. Well, actually, Andrew Perpetua is saying that and I'll play you what he said in a second, that the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians have taken all of this area here, and that would be really significant. So let's just dip into Andrew Perpetua, because I think it's worthwhile.
That's all we got. The most interesting thing to me is that the Russians are claiming that Ukraine has captured this whole area of Krynky. I don't actually know if that's true, but I will tell you that yesterday we had some interesting footage of, we believe these were Krasnopol shellings. So it was laser-guided artillery, and one hit this building right here. So that was interesting, because if you remember back, I used to have this as a gray area, and maybe it still is a gray area, I don't know. I changed it back to Russian-controlled when Ukraine started hitting it with drones pretty consistently. But Ukraine hasn't hit it with drones in a while, and now apparently Russia is shelling it. Although, honestly, I don't know when this video was filmed. And
Krasnopol, so these are laser-guided munitions, as he said, PGN's precision-guided munitions. They are effectively the analog of the Excalibur rounds that the Allied forces use, that Ukraine is using. There's not nearly as much evidence of Russia using these to the same degree as the Ukrainians. I just don't think they have the stockpiles of those, so they don't use them as much. That would be my claim.
They also hit this house over here. So there's that. And I'm sure most people who follow the war have seen that Russia did a pretty large attack here with their mechanized infantry and tanks, etc. One tank catastrophically exploded in this kind of picturesque way. And then they also lost a BMP-3 over here, and maybe a few more vehicles in the town along with that tank. But from what I understand, this attack actually occurred several days ago, like 5 days ago now. And since then, from what I've heard, Russia has not done any large attacks. They kind of got their butt whipped, and they're like, okay, fine, we will attack then.
And that's, of course, been the area where Toplinsky's been in charge and is under an awful lot of pressure. It's not going well for the Russians. Yeah.
And also, I did, what was it, yesterday? I did a video on just Krynky, and you can go watch that if you'd like.
That's where he talked about the Ukrainian troops there really being bait for the Russians. Exactly what I've been saying, to attract and fix the Russian troops in the area so that they can really heavily degrade the Russian troops and equipment.
So I don't really know what else to say. If people have questions, I can answer questions. But the news, when I look at this situation, it looks pretty bad for Russia and also bad for Ukraine. It just looks like both sides are not doing good.
And what he goes on to say, so essentially, even though he's saying that both sides are suffering and the Ukrainians are, we know they are suffering, their hospitals are taking on a lot more patients at the moment near the front lines than they were previously. So we know it's tough for the Ukrainians. Okay, so don't forget that. But the main thrust of his video was this is not looking good for Russia, and this is exactly what I was saying recently, that if this really is like the offensive phase for the Russians at the moment, then they have achieved very little, and they're not looking like they're going to achieve much either. And if they are effectively culminating already, this does not bode well for them. And if the Ukrainians are able to get more funding and more munitions, so the latest news today is that the Europeans might well be able to get them 1 million rounds by the end of, or by spring, and that could be at the expense of their own armed forces and contracts going to outside of Europe. So they're just going to say, right, you can't send anything to anywhere else. It's all going to Ukraine. Now, if then, money and equipment from Germany and other nations starts coming through as they're ramping up production, so it's slow. But then when it starts gathering momentum and things are being built and constructed and the Ukrainian indigenous production capacity is increased, then I know that is why Russia are very much aiming all their missiles and drones at the defense manufacturing capabilities in predominantly Western Ukraine. They are scared because once things start getting moving and Ukraine starts being able to get equipment, it's really all going to come down to boots on the ground, would be my opinion, because I think the equipment will come. And if that money is released by the US, then suddenly you got $61 billion and you've hopefully got an awful lot of equipment. Ukraine just need to be given loads of distance munitions still, like I keep saying. And so they can hammer the heck out of the occupied territories out of Crimea, but then also things like Engels Air Base that was hit last night. So that's over in Saratov, which is back here once it all renders. It's very slow to render, I don't know why. But anyway, they hit Engels 2 Air Base, which is somewhere back here, and that is where the Russians take off there to release their cruise missiles. So if they can hit that en masse, as well as hitting Novorossiysk en masse, which is the home of their Black Sea Fleet now, and the cruise missile carriers, then the Russians will be unable to hit with cruise missiles and whatnot. So it's about gradually getting the advantage. And if the F-16s come online with their better radars that they're being fixed up with, and if Sweden have accession to the EU, which should be the permission to release the Gripens and the Meteors, which have a 200-kilometer range in the sky, then you start thinking they could get offensive advantage in the skies and take out a few Russian airframes, and then things start falling into place. But of course, that's an awful lot of dominoes that still have to fall in the way that they need them to fall. But it's not looking great for Russia. And that's why I said previously, Russia can't win this. The only way they can prevail in this war in any way is contingent upon contingent upon China. So China is the only option for Russia to succeed. It's the only way they're going to get significant enough munitions. Yeah, they can get a little bit from North Korea. They can get a little bit from Iran, and Iran is helping them. And those ballistic missiles from North Korea could be a problem. But if that really becomes overt, and then South Korea go, okay, well, we're going to help out Ukraine, and the rest of the world then gets heavy on the sanctions, and then there are places on the Security Council that might be challenged. It's not easy for Russia to just help themselves to North Korean munitions. And so I think this is generally good news for the Ukrainians at the moment. It will still be tough over the winter, and they will lose territory, but I just don't think the amount of territory that they're losing at the moment and being able to push back in certain places, I just don't think the Russians are able to sustain a major offensive offensive that's anything near meaningful. Now, last thing to say, really, before I go on to the topic of the Ukrainian defences, is in Novomykhailivka, I know there's no changes today, but we did note over the last couple of days that the Russians have been pushed back out of here. Andrew Perpetua had a whole section on this in his video saying that basically, I mean, it's littered with Russian equipment. So all down this road, down another pathway here, all around here, all the way up here. He said that the Russians, tried for this to press all around Novomykhailivka. They really failed in this area there. They got up to the edges of Novomykhailivka, but even with the aviation destruction of Novomykhailivka, it was being flattened completely. They were unable to dislodge like the intelligence units and drone operators and whatnot, and as a result, they have not been able to get a foothold in Novomykhailivka. This wasn't good enough as a foothold, and they've subsequently been pushed back. And it's not looking good for them around there. And that again, that's good news for the Ukrainians. This is an important settlement, and the Ukrainians have withstood the Russian attacks there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens further to the south, and whether they're going to try and do a larger encirclement and push for the road instead of pushing through the settlements, push through this area of ground there. But of course, it leaves them fairly open. It's going to be somewhat flat ground moving in that direction. That's generally what's going on the front line. Hope that was of use. Just a couple of things to share with you. Rebar's complaining about the Dnipro River situation. Sorry, I'm flipping back to the Dnipro now. Says that decisions for the Russian artillery fire are way too slow, and Ukrainian aircraft brazenly fly right over Krynky. Electronic warfare is also lacking for the Russians. General Teplinsky, who was placed in command here, is not helping the situation, something I've said a number of times recently. So again, you can pause the video and read that if you want. I'm not going to read it to you because it says all of what's just been kind of summarized. It is the same situation that the Ukrainians in this area do appear to have electronic warfare advantages, and they are, and that translates into drone advantage, which then translates into being able to degrade the Russian forces by a huge margin. And so it's, really painful for the Russians in that area. Now, I just want to finish the video off with looking at the Ukrainian defensive lines. This is a question that's been asked to me a number of times, and I've been waiting for data to come out on this. And here it is. So this is really, really useful, hopefully. So since 2014, 2022, and more recently, winter 2023, Ukraine has been building a huge defensive system. The multi-layered Donbass line, composed of many trenches in a network that is quite similar to the Russian Surovikin system. So you can see it there. It's now finally being mapped out, and it gives you an understanding of what's going on. I think particularly interesting is out past Avdiivka. You've got some pretty serious trenches going back there, but also this Kramatorsk-Sloviansk crescent, which is incredibly important. That's fairly well defended by the looks of it as well. Less important down here, but you can see where the Ukrainians wanted to put most of their efforts in. Right. When we talk of defensive trench network, the huge Surovikin line is the first thing we think about. Trenches, bunkers, mines, dragon's teeth. This particular system, sometimes compared to the Maginot line, was one of the assets that stopped the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive. So as you can see on my map, it's indicated by the yellow lines on my map, and that is a significant set of fortifications that is that did cause the Ukrainians all sorts of headaches. Since it's already mapped by many, it's not useful to talk about it. However, I've also mapped pre-2022 Russian defenses. It is interesting to see that these particular trench systems can still be used in case of a Ukrainian breakthrough. So there are some trench systems behind the initial first, second, third defensive lines. But he says, let's talk about the Ukrainian defensive lines I call the Donbass line. Donbass line is quite different and more complex than the Russian Surovikin system. It is composed of highly defended fortified systems separated by fields. I've shown you some images of some of those metal sort of tunnels that are lifted in and some of the building work, because this has been Ukraine able to put their industrial might as a country behind building that, rather than an invading force that's trying to co-opt the occupied services in the area and trying to build trenches. I think it's possibly easier for Ukraine to build more significant and more thought out and planned trench systems than the Russians, and I think you're probably seeing that. If we take the example of the Ukrainsk-Marinka line facing south near Kurakove, so that's in this general area, we can see on this Sentinel-2 imagery that each system is separated by a kilometer at least. Each fort can defend itself from every direction. You have to take all of them to advance. So this is really important because actually this is in that Novomykhailivka area. So the Kurakove is the more important settlement behind there, along from Novomykhailivka through Avdiivka and then eventually onto Kurakove. And that's what this chap's talking about. So along here to, I presume, or maybe, yeah, I don't know where. Let's have a little look. Nazejdinka and Novomykhailivka. My goodness, you don't make it easy, guys. Okay, I've actually geolocated this area. It's not by Kurakove, which actually is behind Marinka, not behind Novomykhailivka down there. So here we have the line towards Kurakove, but actually this is all the way over in this direction here. This is where we're talking about. So that is considerably behind. So that's the fortifications they're talking about, considerably behind the front line area. But anyway, still fortifications built, serious fortifications built. And it's important that you have to take all of them in order to take any of them, I guess, in a sense. Or yeah, well, you know what I mean. Contrary to the Russian line, the Ukrainian one is composed of many forts that are defending each other. The 2014-15 Popasno-Luhansk line is a good example. To break through, you have to assure that no other fort has fire control on you. This particular line, however, was abandoned, and that didn't help matters at all. Anyway, the zero line, this was the 2014 to 2022 line. It was composed of two systems near Mariupol, overrun in a few days because of lack of personnel. Two lines near Popasno, Ukraine retreated to the city, and one line between Marinka and Vuhledar with some parts still standing. So, of course, it depends how you use these. It's not just about having the fortifications, but you need the troops to be able to defend them and the tactics and all sorts. But you can see that actually, these are fairly substantial lines that were already existing. And yeah, that's Donetsk there. So this is all within the presently occupied territories. But that could have been useful if it was properly utilized by the Ukrainians. But unfortunately, they let the Russians overrun it. The really first line, built from February to June 2022, preparing the retreat of Severodonetsk, was built from southern Bakhmut to Seversk, passing through Vuhledar. This defensive system had two lines. Both were overrun in Bakhmut and Vuhledar, but are still standing in Seversk. So there were some trenches that existed in the area that the Ukrainians to try to use to some degree, and still exist in Seversk. So Seversk is, some people say that would be quite a tough nut for the Russians to crack, but that would be one of their goals, certainly in that neck of the woods. At the same time, Ukrainians built lines 1, 2, and 3 in northern Donbass. Today, they're still building these lines. Line 1 is Sversky Donetsk River, Chasivyar to Toretsk. Line 2 and 3 are the defences of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Two lines are protecting Slovyansk from the north, an anti-tank ditch, and one line protecting the twin cities from the west, and two lines protecting Konstantinivka and Druzhkivka. In other words, so this is that, I'll show you on my map just to give you an idea. You might be slightly more familiar. So this is the crescent of towns and cities I keep talking about: Toretsk, Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and then you can add Seversk possibly onto the end of that in that sort of big semicircle there. Well, you can now see how many trenches have been built and rather large fortifications, and of course there'll be smaller ones in tree lines and fields and whatnot, I would assume as well. Or if the Russians were to advance, then you could fairly quickly build those. Now, some may ask themselves, the defences after Avdiivka are already prepared but non-sufficient. The main line is 17 kilometres from the city. This line is, however, behind a river and lakes, making it a natural barrier. Okay, so there you have what's been prepared, because this is the area that most people have been asking about. Well, if Avdiivka does fall, where do the Ukrainians fall back to? And that gives you an indication of where it would be. The final objective of the Russian offensive may be to reach Pokrovsk. That's the city that took a bit of a hammering by air recently. Reach Pokrovsk, the last big city and industrial center of Ukrainian Donbass, with Kramatorsk. The Ukrainian armed forces have built a 2-layered trench system all around the city. So you can see that's a bit like Tokmak, but I would imagine that these trenches might be more substantial, but correct me if I'm wrong. Support lines. Donbass is a thing, but there are 3 other fronts: Kherson, south, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk, Kharkiv up in the north. Apart from the Mykolaiv defense network and old Russian Kherson defenses, I haven't found any Ukrainian line in the oblast. So they've really been focusing much more on that Donbass area. In Zaporizhia Oblast, there are at least 2 main defensive lines, plus a line defending the city itself. In Luhansk front line, we have the Liman-Borova line, which is quite impressive. There's also a line near Izium. In other words, they are working on these different places. So that's to say that there are defensive lines here. All the ones around this area, that's your main area of defense, but also up here as well. So Borova, that was mentioned, is this town there where the Russians were trying to get to by advancing from Svatove. But one assumes that there's some pretty substantial trench lines there if this thread is to be believed. Currently, I'm investigating Ukrainian defences on the Russian border, the Kupiansk-Volchansk line, the Kharkiv defences and border defences in Sumy and Chernihiv oblasts. For now, I haven't found many things suggesting it's just the beginning. I mean, they are definitely building lines up there. I've reported on that recently. How do those systems look? Well, this image is a high-resolution one from Google Earth Pro. You can see part of the Western Slavyansk defence. A Ukrainian trench is never linear and is not always linked, to avoid losing a whole line if part has fallen. That's really interesting. So you don't actually join it up into one contiguous line. Actually, you have them in sections so that you don't, if you lose one part, you don't lose it all. Ukrainians made fun of Russian anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, but they are now using them. You can also see this new basement to protect soldiers from artillery and FPV shells. I was one who didn't take the piss out of Dragon's Teeth too much, because I said that they are something and they will slow. You still have to navigate them, and if you've got mines all around, Dragon's Teeth, and you're being hit by artillery and ATGMs, that's nothing to shrug off. They may look ridiculous, but actually they are something, and that is why they wouldn't be put in place by the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians hadn't found them at least somewhat challenging in their attacks to the south. To geolocalize these trench networks, I use 4 elements: Google Earth updates, Sentinel-2 imagery, geolocated videos, and other images, so on and so forth. And he goes on to talk about that. So anyway, I thought that was of interest to you, to let you know that there are significant trench networks being built, not everywhere, but in some of your main places. It's interesting that they don't really see the Russians having the ability to strike back into Kherson Oblast, particularly towards Mykolaiv, even though that's what some of the generals say is one of the basic intentions of the Russian invasion is to get to Transnistria, is to take all this area, and it doesn't seem particularly realistic that they will be able to do that, and that's possibly indicated by the Ukrainians' confidence in not building any trench lines on the other side of the river. Anyway, let me know what you think. I know that took up some extra time, but hopefully it was useful to you. Take care, speak soon.